From the very first moment I can remember, my father's voice was a hammer striking against my small, fragile self. "The problem child," he said, and I carried those words like a brand, seared onto my skin, marking me for a life I didn't choose. It wasn't a nickname he gave lightly, like a playful tease. It was a verdict, a permanent sentence that shaped every corner of my existence. When I was 7, I came home from school clutching an art project I had spent hours creating. My father barely glanced at it before throwing it onto the kitchen counter. "Why do you always ruin everything you touch?" he barked. Tears blurred my vision as I scrambled to pick up the scattered pieces of my drawing, my small hands trembling. That night, as I lay in bed, I whispered into the darkness, "Am I really the problem child? Or am I just not enough?" School wasn't a refuge either. Teachers would sometimes offer faint praise, but it never lasted. I learned quickly that success was temporary, fragile, and meaningless if my father could tear it down with a single sentence. My classmates sensed it too. Whispers followed me through hallways, shadows of the judgment I had grown up with. Every achievement I had, every attempt at kindness or courage, seemed to vanish under his condemnation. Even my mother, gentle and soft-spoken, could not shield me. She loved me in her quiet way, but fear kept her silent. I would catch her glancing at me with sorrow in her eyes, lips pressed tight, as if she wanted to say something, anything to protect me, but couldn't. And so I learned early that love could be silent, and silence could hurt just as much as words. By the time I reached my teenage years, the label had become a second skin. I stopped asking questions in class, stopped trying to please, and stopped believing that my voice mattered. My father's words echoed in my head constantly. The problem child, the one who ruins everything. I felt the weight of every failure, real or imagined, pressing down, shaping me into someone smaller than I wanted to be. Yet beneath the crushing weight of his judgment, a quiet fire burned. A tiny ember of rebellion, of hope, flickered in the corners of my heart. Somewhere deep inside, I believed that one day I would be more than his words. I would be more than the label he imposed. And although I could not see the path clearly, I clung to the idea that life might offer justice in ways I could not yet imagine. Family gatherings were a battlefield. Relatives would side, step the tension, offering polite smiles while avoiding my father's scathing gaze. Yet I always felt the weight of scrutiny, the sense that I was constantly failing some invisible test. Birthdays, holidays, even simple dinners became exercises in survival of spirit, if not of body. I learned to hide, to shrink into the background, to vanish into my own shadow whenever his storm approached. But hiding only sharpened the pain. At night, I would stare at old family photos, tracing the faces with my fingers, longing for a father's approval that would never come. "Why can't he love me?" I whispered into the darkness. "Am I really so broken?" And yet, amid the hurt and confusion, I promised myself silently that I would endure. That someday, somehow, the truth of who I was would shine brighter than the lies he told. That ember in me, small, fragile, but unyielding, became my companion. It whispered that my worth was not determined by the cruel words of a man who should have cherished me. It told me that one day the scales of justice might tip. And even if that day seemed impossibly distant, I held on to it, letting it grow quietly, steadily, like roots stretching toward light through dark soil. I was the problem child, yes, but deep in my chest, beneath the pain, beneath the shame, I was learning that perhaps the real problem had never been me. Perhaps the problem had been him all along. For 29 years, I lived under the shadow of my father's words. The problem child became not just a label, but a lens through which I saw myself. Every success was diminished by the echo of his voice. Every failure was amplified 1,000 times. I became an expert at silence, at bending my thoughts, my desires, even my laughter, to avoid inciting his wrath. I tried desperately to prove him wrong. I studied relentlessly, seeking excellence in every test and project. I chased accolades and awards, hoping that someday he might look at me and say, "You are not a problem." Yet the words never came. If anything, my achievements became fuel for his scorn. "You only do well to show off," he would say, as if my very effort was a crime. Friends became my lifeline. They offered the warmth and acceptance my family withheld. With them, I laughed freely, confided in secret, and dared to dream of a life where my worth was not questioned at every turn. Yet even with friends, a part of me remained hyper, aware, always bracing for the moment when my father's judgment would strike again. Love, too, was complicated. Romantic relationships often crumbled under the weight of my insecurities, nurtured over decades by his relentless criticism. I feared abandonment, failure, and the very idea of being a problem in someone else's eyes. Intimacy was a battlefield where my father's voice whispered relentlessly, "You are not enough. You will never be enough." Despite this, I carved out a life that on paper appeared successful. A good job, a small circle of friends who cared, and a semblance of stability. I smiled, I laughed, I even thrived, but always with one foot in the shadow, waiting for the next blow. The years of silence taught me patience, endurance, and perhaps most importantly, the art of hiding pain in plain sight. Birthdays and holidays were torture. I learned to sit quietly, nodding politely while my father's critiques flew like arrows. "You never think before you speak," he would say, or, "You'll never amount to anything if you keep acting like this." And I would swallow the sting, smile weakly, and retreat into myself, counting the moments until I could escape back into the sanctuary of solitude. Late at night, when the house was still and the world had gone quiet, I would sit alone, staring at the ceiling, tracing imaginary lines of escape in the shadows. My mind replayed every word, every glance, every accusation. Why me? I would ask the dark. What did I do to deserve this? What did I ever do wrong? And yet, amidst the hurt, something resilient began to grow. I realized slowly that his power over me was limited to the words he spoke, the home he controlled, and the past I had endured. But my life, my choices, my accomplishments, my dreams, belonged to me. Even if he refused to see my worth, I could cultivate it quietly, like a garden in secret, nourished by determination rather than approval. During these years, I discovered that survival was not just physical but emotional. Every smile I forced, every laugh I faked, every compliment I received from friends became armor. I learned to protect myself, to fortify the fragile parts of my spirit that he had so often tried to break. And through this, a subtle but powerful truth emerged. The man who had called me worthless for decades could never take my life, my achievements, or my essence from me. Yet the ember of resentment, long smoldering beneath the ashes of my pain, continued to burn. I did not yet know how or when it would flare into action, but the thought of one day revealing the truth to him lingered, growing stronger with each passing year. For now, though, I remained patient, careful, enduring. I was silent, yes. I was wounded, yes. But I was also learning, shaping, growing into someone unrecognizable to the father who had spent a lifetime defining me as the problem. And in that quiet endurance, a plan, vague, half-formed, yet undeniably present, was beginning to take root. The years of silence were not empty. They were preparation. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, unassuming and quiet, like any other day, yet it would shatter the foundation of everything I thought I knew. The letter sat on the kitchen table, folded neatly, with my mother's familiar handwriting across the front. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of curiosity and dread as I picked it up. For decades, I had carried a heavy burden, one that was not mine to bear. My father had labeled me the problem child, with relentless consistency, using it as a weapon to control, belittle, and humiliate me. I had endured every insult, every accusation, every whispered judgment, believing it was the truth. And yet, this small envelope hinted that the universe might finally offer an answer, one that could unravel the carefully constructed narrative of my life. I tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside were the results of a DNA test, something my mother had quietly arranged, a secret she had kept for years, waiting for the right moment. I didn't know what I expected, perhaps some validation, perhaps reassurance that my suffering was real, but the truth hit me like a lightning bolt. My father was not biologically related to me. I stared at the numbers and charts, my mind struggling to comprehend. Not my father. Not the man who had dictated my worth for 29 years. The very man who had molded my self-image, who had punished me for imagined flaws, who had used his own bitterness as a measure of my value. It had all been based on a lie. For a long moment, I felt nothing but disbelief. Then came the surge of emotions I could hardly contain. Anger, sorrow, and an almost intoxicating relief all rolled into one. Rage boiled in my chest, hot and raw, as I realized the depth of the betrayal. My life, my identity, had been defined by a man who had no claim to it whatsoever. And yet, beneath the fury, a strange sweetness stirred the knowledge that I had been wronged. But I now held the undeniable truth. Tears blurred my vision as I sank into a chair, holding the paper like a talisman. Memories flooded in every insult, every unfair punishment, every night spent staring at the ceiling, questioning my worth. It had never been me. I had never been the problem. For nearly 3 decades, I had carried shame that belonged to someone else, a burden that was never mine to bear. The world suddenly felt different. The air in the room seemed lighter, and the weight I had carried for so long began to shift. I realized with a strange clarity that this revelation changed everything. My father's power over me, built over years of fear and manipulation, was gone. He could no longer define me, belittle me, or dictate my story. The truth was now mine, and mine alone. But with that clarity came a new feeling, the urge for justice, for acknowledgement, for a reckoning. Not in a way that would humiliate or destroy him, though part of me imagined the satisfaction of seeing him face the truth, but in a way that would honor the life I had lived, the years I had endured, and the resilience I had cultivated. I realized that my revenge would not be petty. It would be sweet, quiet, and undeniable, a life lived fully, a story reclaimed, a truth revealed. I folded the results carefully and held them close. For years I had been silenced, forced to hide my pain and shrink my existence. Now I had a weapon far stronger than anger or words, truth, and with it came the freedom I had longed for, a chance to step out of the shadow of a man who had never truly been my father. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting long shadows across the room, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The ember that had burned quietly in my chest for decades was now a roaring flame, fueled not just by anger, but by possibility. The next steps had to be measured, careful, deliberate. The years of silence, of endurance, had taught me patience, and patience would serve me well now. I didn't yet know exactly how I would reveal the truth, how I would confront the man who had spent almost 3 decades defining me as the problem child. But I knew this. The reckoning would come, and when it did, it would be in my terms. And in that moment, I allowed myself the first real smile I had given in decades, not of joy, not yet, but of anticipation. Because the scales of justice had shifted, and I was finally holding the balance. The problem child, it seemed, was no longer defined by the man who had named her. The problem child was now a woman armed with truth, ready to claim her story, her dignity, and in her own quiet way, her sweet revenge. The revelation of the DNA results left me shaken, yet strangely empowered. For the first time in 29 years, I understood that the man who had called me the problem child had no right to define me. And with that truth came a clarity I had never felt before. Revenge would not be explosive or cruel. It would be deliberate, elegant, and profoundly satisfying. I spent weeks planning, not in anger, but in precision. I reclaimed every corner of my life, amplifying the success I had quietly built while he believed he had the power to diminish me. I advanced in my career, earned recognition for projects I had poured my soul into, and cultivated a personal life that radiated confidence and joy. Every accomplishment became a quiet announcement to the world. I was no longer the child defined by his words. Then came the moment to confront him, to show, not just tell, the power of truth. I invited him to a small gathering, a celebration of my recent achievements. The venue was warm, filled with colleagues, friends, and family members who had supported me. who had seen the real me all along. I knew he would arrive, confident in his control, expecting to witness the same timid, uncertain child he had spent decades shaping. When he walked in, I felt the old pangs of anxiety, the reflexive bracing for criticism, but it was fleeting. I saw his eyes widen almost immediately, scanning the room, taking in the confident, poised woman who stood at the center of attention. A woman transformed. Gone was the quiet, shrinking child. In her place was a presence that demanded recognition. I waited for the right moment, speaking with friends, sharing laughter, allowing the scene to unfold naturally. And then, quietly, I guided him aside, handing him an envelope. The same DNA results that had shaken my world months before now rested in his hands. He blinked at the paper, confusion rippling across his face. I watched as disbelief, then shock, began to settle in. There were no words yet, only the slow dawning of comprehension, the realization that the man who had spent nearly 3 decades diminishing me had no claim to the identity he had tried to control. I spoke softly, deliberately, letting each word land with precision. For 29 years, you called me the problem child. You told me I was flawed, that I was worthless, that I ruined everything I touched, and yet. I paused, letting the silence stretch. You were never even my father. These are the results. I am not your child, by blood or by truth. He staggered backward, almost as if the words themselves carried weight. I could see the color drain from his face, the reality settling like a stone in his chest. There was no shouting, no anger, no pleading, just silence, and the undeniable power of truth. I didn't gloat. I didn't mock, I didn't need to. The victory was in the revelation itself, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I had survived, thrived, and reclaimed my story. My triumph was not in his humiliation, but in my freedom. As I turned away, walking back to the circle of friends who had always believed in me, I felt a lightness I had never known. For decades, I had carried the weight of his words, letting them shape my identity, my self-worth. Now that weight was gone. The ember of resentment had been replaced with a fire of purpose and confidence. Later, as I reflected on the moment, I realized that revenge was never about punishing him. It was about claiming my own life, my own happiness, and my own narrative. For 29 years, I had been forced into a role not of my making. Now I had stepped into a life of my own choosing, a life defined not by criticism or cruelty, but by truth, strength, and dignity. The man who once had power over me now stood witness to the woman I had become. He had spent a lifetime calling me a problem, never realizing that the problem was never me. It was him, and the lie he built. I had no need for anger now, only peace, and in that peace was the sweetest revenge, living fully, beautifully, and unapologetically, free from the shadow of a man who never deserved to define me. I raised a glass with my friends that night, a quiet celebration of truth, resilience, and victory. The problem child had survived, had flourished, and had finally claimed her story, and in that triumph I found something more precious than vengeance, freedom, dignity, and a life wholly my own.